Order. This is our first session by the International Development Select Committee on the UK's commitment and spend on international climate finance. We've got two panels today. If I could ask the first panel to introduce themselves. I'll go round. Elizabeth, if you could introduce yourself first, then Zahid, then Dishon, please.
Hello, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Wathuti. I'm calling in from Nairobi, Kenya. I'm an environmentalist and founder of the Green Generation Initiative, working directly with local communities to restore degraded ecosystems and also on source water protection while building climate resilience for the communities on the front line of the impacts of the climate crisis. Thank you.
Thank you. Zahid.
Hi everyone, my name is Zahid Shashoto. I work for a grassroots organization called Uttaran. I live in the southwest coastal part of Bangladesh, and I work with climate change, land rights, and water governance. My organization have been working with the support of FCDO or the British government for the past 2.5 decades. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Dishon.
Yes, good evening, Chair and honorable members of the International Development Committee. My name is Dishon Murage, and first I would like to, first of all, thank you so much sincerely for this opportunity to participate in this evidence session. I'm a Kenyan coastal and marine fractioneer working within the Kenyan coastal region, covering Kenya as well as Tanzania, with over 25 years experience. I work for a local organization called Oceans Alive Foundation as their technical advisor on core management, monitoring and evaluation. And I'm also the East Africa representative for an international organization called Sea Ecology Foundation. I'm glad for this opportunity because I think the committee inquiry in regard to effectiveness of funding received from the UK is something that I could say personally I've been a beneficiary of that funding through various initiatives that we have supported along the Kenyan coast. And I'm glad for this opportunity to share what that funding has been able to do, particularly within the local communities that have been working in the last 25 years. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Well, thank you so much for being with us. Should I call you Lionel or should I call you Dishon? Or both?
Both.
Yeah, we would
fine.
do both from this point forward then. Let me ask Brian to start with the questions.
Thank you. I'm going to start with you, Elizabeth, if I may. How has climate change affected your local community or the communities which your organisation supports?
Thank you. So climate change has been a daily reality for the communities that we work with, and we're seeing impacts on the extremes, especially when it comes to the prolonged droughts that are then followed by the intense flooding that continues to affect lives and livelihoods. And we've also seen crops fail, livestock lost, and also water sources dry up. And we all know that when the rivers dry up, it means that everything else dries with them, including the livelihoods that depend on those rivers and also the nutrition, because we need the water to be able to grow our food, and also education and stability, because it also means that the children within the institutions are not also able to access their institutions, especially when there's extreme weather patterns. And just to share some two recent examples that would really illustrate the lived reality of the climate crisis. Just about 3 weeks ago in Kenya, we had the pastoralists in northern Kenya who were actually forced to sell their cattle for as low as 500 Kenya shillings. That's about £3 approximately. And this was due to the prolonged drought that led to the collapse of also the grazing systems, because when again it's very dry, it means that the livestock cannot survive within these communities. And these are communities that heavily depend on the livestock as their primary source of income and livelihood at the same time. And right now, following the unusually heavy rains in February, just outside our normal seasonal pattern, the farmers are also facing the crop losses as the produce rots in the fields. And this is while they wait for it to dry before harvesting. And the pastoralists, on the other hand, are also facing the renewed risks of flooding. So this is what climate change means for the frontline communities, where different patterns are really affected, and it means that it's not business as usual, because then the lives and the livelihoods are actually at risk. And the aspect that has really continued to mostly impact is especially on the children and the women in the communities. And at the Green Generation Initiative, we work a lot with farmers that are especially close to some critical water catchment areas. And this network of farmers has actually been really greatly impacted with the extreme changing patterns of the weather that are almost unpredictable right now. And this actually calls for urgent action on how we address the climate impact on the communities that are most affected, but at the same time, how we accelerate locally led solutions, because these communities are not just standing by, but they're leading solutions using their own locally led information to be able to support themselves to build their own resilience to the climate crisis. So this is also an aspect of economic stability, and it's also an aspect of us being able to protect lives, to protect livelihoods, and ensure that our ecosystems are also stable.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And just very briefly, your perception of how things are changing over, let's say, the last 5 years. The climate and its effect.
Yeah, I would say each year we are faced with different challenges. And I remember a few years back in Glasgow when I was speaking about a prolonged drought situation at the World Leader Summit, where we had more than 2 million Kenyans facing climate-related starvation. And this year, there has actually been a repeat of a similar number of people facing the hunger crisis. And this is an aspect that shows that we are still a bit far away in terms of how we are addressing the crisis and in terms of how we are getting communities ready for disaster. So I think there's a big aspect when it comes to disaster preparedness and being able to build on the locally led solutions where communities can actually be able to deal with the disasters and the rising impacts of climate change on their own. And I think this is also a matter of being able to decentralize resources so that communities can be able to address the aspects and the impacts that are affecting them right from their background.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And to you, Zahid, perhaps you can talk a little bit about how climate change is affecting your communities.
Thank you so much. Of course, there are, of course, similar to Elizabeth, in my community, I can list down loads of examples. I'll list those examples, but I'll also add 2 more points. Just a few examples. In the last 6 years, in my community, even though the IPCC report says cyclones in countries like Bangladesh would intensify, and the frequency would remain the same, we have seen the frequency has increased. In the last 6 years, we had 5 major cyclones. Last year, the rain was supposed to stop by July, August, by end of monsoon. It rained so much in September, October, that the farmers could not do the dry season crop in some of the floodplains. So that's another example. This year, after the dry season, now we use irrigation water to do another crop, but it's already getting so extreme heat. As soon as the winter stop, there are viruses that are damaging the crop, the paddy tops. It's burning and it's turning reddish. And I can give out loads of examples to such climate change events. In my house where I live, it was underwater in 2015, 2014. And even the office I work at the moment, it was underwater, and we used to take a boat to go to our office, and then we had to leave it for 2 years and then come back. And I can list down many examples. Of course, there is a gap in countries like ours where we lack evidences of what is actually climate change and what is something else. But what I want to say and take this opportunity that climate change builds on existing vulnerabilities we had. The people, yesterday I was in a village where from 2017 till now, agricultural land have reduced by 35%. And this wasn't not converted to something else. This was basically taken away by the river, by the sea. And so they had to push back the embankment more and more inside. And this is just one village of 500, 600 families, which used to be 600. Now it's about 480, about 120 have migrated permanently. So of course I can give those examples, but to you, the committee, I also want to give this thought that one of the reason that people from my community lives in the farthest edge of the land, near to the sea, near to the river, is because not because there is an economic poverty, it's because of the structural poverty, where the reason why we have landless people, it's because of the Colonial Land Reformation Act, where land became a commodity and was taken by rich class people in the community, and the poor were left with nothing. So they lived and they were pushed back to the edge of the embankment, where it's government land, lives on the dikes or very close to the dikes, where the land is very low. And whenever there is a breach of that dike or that embankment, they are the one who gets pushed away. So the question is, of course, climate change is making us more and more vulnerable because there is more and more cyclone and more tidal surge. But the question is, why are people living in a place where no one should live? So that's one question. The second thing is, of course, that was in the 1800, 1700. In the later part, we had maldevelopment. We introduced systems like the polder system from the Dutch, where it made the delta formation practically stopped in some parts of the country. Some part it was good, some part it was bad. Some part initially it saw good green revolution, but then for that all the rivers are dying. So now when you have more tidal surge, the river does not have a capacity to hold that much water. It overtops the embankments and the dikes. At the same time, the water from the monsoon cannot escape the floodplain, because now the riverbed is higher than the floodplain. And so people have converted their land to shrimp farms, because you cannot take the water out, so let the salt water in. And the salt water, which used to come 6 hours every day because of high tide, it used to come 6 hours, then go away. Now, for the past 2 decades, you have permanent saltwater shrimps on a land. And of course, I can blame climate change because it's giving erratic rainfall, but I also have to blame that because of that maldevelopment, people started shrimp, and that is one of the reasons salinity, groundwater salinity is increasing. Of course, climate change is to blame because now the the rain pattern is not for 3, 4, 5 months. It's not distributed evenly. It's distributed, it's very intense in a few days and then it's gone. So of course that has an impact. But it also started because there is maldevelopment. The question is, what are the impacts of climate change in my community? There are also questions why there are impacts of climate change in my community, and that is also something related to maldevelopment and our colonial past. So those questions are also needed to be asked, and also finances should be molded in a way where it addresses all three, not just climate change, but our structural marginalization or maldevelopment that we had, and how we can correct those courses to reduce climate change impacts that's happening now, and which is aggravating.
Thank you.
So yes, okay, yeah.
Thank you, Zahid. I think we get the picture. Lionel, if you can perhaps give us how your communities are being affected by climate change, please.
Okay, thank you. As I mentioned earlier, I work within the coastal and the marine sector, working mostly with artisanal communities that are fishermen. And just a background about our kind of communities. Most of our fisheries are artisanal. Most of it taken within inshore coastal areas. Our fishermen rarely venture out beyond 3 nautical miles from the shore. Now, a key feature about our fishery resources is that they are mainly dependent on coral reefs. They are very closely linked with coral reefs and seagrass. And the most unfortunate thing that happened over the last 20 years that has had a very huge impact on these coastal communities are negative impacts of climate change, especially aspect to do with the rising sea level temperature, sea temperatures of the sea, as well as the rise in sea level. Now, just looking back historically, really before 1980s, essentially, we didn't have coral bleaching events actually. This phenomenon called coral bleaching is a phenomenon that actually we started experiencing actually towards the late 90s. Around 1998 is when we actually experienced the first major coral bleaching event within our coastal and marine waters. And the most unfortunate thing is that since 1998 until 2025, we have experienced a total of 5 major coral bleaching events. 4 of those coming within the period from 2016 to 2024. Now, the major impact this has had is that coral bleaching is something that negatively affects our coral reefs in such a way that, one, the 2024 coral bleaching event actually affected nearly 60% of our coral cover. As a result, most of our coral reefs have not recovered yet. And actually, the latest report that we are receiving now, because we are heading to what we consider as an intermonsoon period, which is essentially the hottest period of the year, is that there is already an indication that the sea surface temperatures are rising, meaning there's a likelihood that you're even going to encounter another coral bleaching event soon. That means we're expected to experience another major bleaching event within a very short period of time, since the major one that we reported latest was just in 2024. Now, the coral bleaching, once it occurs, it means the coral reefs, most of them don't recover, they die. And the result of dying off is also associated with reduced fishing catches and population. And this is something that has been taking place, as I mentioned, within the last 20 years. The severity and the frequency has increased, and it's coming to us at a time when in a region whereby most of the coastal communities are considered living below the poverty line. I'll give you a good example. The average poverty rate in Kenya is about 36%. Communities living along the Kenyan coast, in the 5 coastal communities, the poverty rates are between 46 and 49%. These are communities that are solely dependent on nature for their livelihood. They are either subsistence farmers or they are fishermen. So we are facing a situation whereby it's actually a situation that I could say is becoming dire and dire every day. The ones that depend on the marine resources, they are actually relying on a resource that's being negatively affected by factors beyond their control. And even the ones that rely on subsistence farming, the most unfortunate thing is also the other aspect of unpredictable rainfall. The subsistence farmers for the last 5 years, Kenya particularly, has had a major challenge and experience in terms of predictability, frequency, and even the volume of rainfall that we're having. And actually, for instance, I'll give you a good example. Just last year, in the October, November, December, most of the coastal regions did not receive the short rains. Short rains, which actually most of the farmers also rely on to actually grow short-term crops, be it maize, sorghum, millet, or any other food crops that don't require a long growing period. Those rains failed. So as we are speaking right now, we are having communities that are relying on a resource that actually is no longer able to provide them with a reliable source of food, even so as a source of income. The other major impact that we also have along our Kenyan coast as a result of actually climate change is sea level rise. On average, it has already been indicated even from our own studies as well as other studies that on average, the sea level is rising on an average between 3 to 5 millimeters within our coastal region every year, 3 to 5 millimeters. It might seem as a very negligible, but the aspect of that rise is that it has led to increased beach erosions. And in cases where even you have mangroves, where the landward side has been development, means the sea level, they are not able to adapt to the sea level rise because they have no other areas to migrate. Now, it's very unfortunate because for Kenya, tourism is one of the key sectors the country relies on its economy. And one of the biggest sources of the income in terms of tourism is along the Kenyan coast is beach tourism. Most people travel from within the country as well as from outside the country to come and enjoy the beaches. Now, you come to most of the beaches, one of the key things that you find that is featuring that didn't exist 20 years back were beach walls. And these are being constructed merely because most of the beaches are now experiencing increased rates of erosion. Some of it may be driven by other factors, either as a result of unplanned development, but also because of this sea level rise. It may seem minuscule, but it's having a huge, huge impact actually within our local communities as well as our national economy. The other one is that because Kenya essentially has two major rivers, Athi River and Tana River. And the most unfortunate thing, because of that unpredictability as well as low rainfall, some of these rivers in the areas where they drain into the sea, be it be in the delta, that is Tana River, for instance, and also in the Athi River, because of those low volumes of freshwater draining to the sea, what we are increasingly observing is the saltwater intrusion inland. And in actual sense, we are having situations whereby areas, also some lakes that were actually freshwater previously have now turned brackish because that aspect of refreshment or rather renewal from freshwater is no longer taking place. And it's actually a major driver because for some of the communities, particularly in those areas that have indicated, they have been relying on some of these freshwater input, and there's a huge fishery that actually is associated within these deltas. That is the shrimp and the prawns. Now we are seeing a situation because of this reduced inflow of fresh water, that those catches that were being experienced previously have reduced drastically. As we are even right now as I'm speaking, actually the number of licenses that have been issued have actually have also reduced. But also the other aspect is that even the catches associated within those areas, like the trawling that also from the prawn and the shrimp, has also reduced drastically. So the most unfortunate thing is that these occurrences are actually increasing at a higher rate, at such a huge frequency, and some of the drivers to these occurrences are actually beyond the local community, actually even beyond what the government of Kenya can do. These are some of the only way to drive some the changes that are necessary to mitigate against whatever is happening is actually calls for the global community to work together. So essentially that's the briefly, but just to indicate actually climate change is having a huge negative impact.
Lionel,
yes.
Can you tell us, have there been any attempts to reseed the coral, to regrow the coral?
Yes.
Can you give
there have been.
Yeah.
Good. Yes, actually, there have been quite a number of attempts. The first coral reef restoration attempt was actually started in 2014 in a place called Wasini. I was a member of the team during the coral reef restoration. We undertook that exercise, participating in the Kenya Marine Fisheries Research Institute. And since then, there have been other attempts to actually restore corals along the Kenyan coast. There are attempts that are currently ongoing right here at Oceans Alive Foundation. Then there have been other attempts that have continued in the same place, Wasini, extend to other neighboring communities, be it in Kwiro, as well as Diani. And there are also other attempts that are actually taking place in Lamu, as well as in other places or other parts of the Kenyan coast. Now, the coral bleaching event that took place in 2014 actually affected to a large extent some of these restoration projects that were being attempted, to an extent that for some of these projects that were actually privately funded by certain donors, after observing that major effect on those restored corals, for some of these donors have withdrawn their support to some of these initiatives. But
Lionel, are you saying these attempts have not worked, or have you had any success with it?
Yes, we have had. I'm just highlighting. So the ones that we are attempting here at Oceans Alive have actually experienced some success, and they are actually ongoing. We are currently scaling up. What the coral bleaching event that took place in 2024 was a huge, big lesson to some of us. particularly in terms of the species that are selected for restoration, sites that are selected for restoration, and also the engagement of other communities. Restoration by itself is actually a very expensive affair. And actually, when you engage local community, it has a huge impact on cost. The other thing was the species. The bleaching event that we experienced in 2024 did not affect all coral species the same way. We have observed that after the bleaching effect, some coral species were able to recover quickly. But unfortunately, for some of the coral species that are considered massive, unfortunately, they have not been able to recover as quickly as possible.
Lionel,
So actually
Lionel, I'm going to
Yes, go
stop you
ahead.
there. I am obsessed with corals, so I could listen to you all day. But we do have some other questions, so I'm going to ask. I think Brian's got one more for Elizabeth, and then we'll ask other members to come in, and then you and I need to have a very large cup of coffee and talk about corals off the screen. Thank you.
Marvellous. So
Welcome.
quickly back to you, Elizabeth. If we could talk a little bit from your experience, how has climate change contributed to inequality, poverty, or threatened water? And sorry, going on to the next one. Which groups of people are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, and why?
And that's just to Elizabeth, please.
Yeah, so from the communities that we've been working with, we've mostly seen that the women and the children are most vulnerable to the impacts of the climate crisis. And the children one is because they are the ones that have to go a day without food within their institutions, because when we have the prolonged drought situation, it means that the crops fail and the farmers are not able to grow enough food to even feed the families. And that means that even the children have difficulties when they are when they're trying to access their education. And it's very difficult for them to actually carry on within a conducive environment when they're facing the hunger crisis. And the second aspect, especially in the arid and semi-arid areas, we see a lot of malnutrition within especially for the children and also again for the young mothers. And this is a big challenge that continues to really be accelerated when we have the impacts of the climate crisis. And again, when we have the extreme flood situations, also the children are not able to access their institutions and even basic care services, because it means that these institutions almost become inaccessible. Because when we have flooding situations, there are instances where schools are completely covered in water, and it means that they have to wait until the water subsides for them to be able to go back to school. And on the other hand, we have, of course, in a normal setting, the women are the ones that are tasked with the responsibility of looking for food, looking for water for their families. And it means that when they're not able to provide when we have the impacts of the climate crisis, there are also domestic conflicts and violence that arise from it. So there's a lot of ripple impact and effects that continue to affect the communities, especially the children and the women who I believe and have seen are the most impacted by this crisis.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. James.
Thank you, Chair. If I can come to Zahid first. You talked earlier about climate finance and said that you'd been accessing it for many years as an organisation. Can you describe the type of UK climate finance that you've been accessing and the process by which you secured that money and how that process worked?
Thank you. For me, I wouldn't be able to distinguish between which one was climate finance and which was under general finance. But the one of the first time we had FCDO funding was during flood in my communities. It's not a flood; it's called waterlogging, where the water remains waterlogged for 6 months back in 2000. And so homes, crop fields, and everything. We also had an education fund through separate. I'll not bring that in a climate change, but let's start with the disaster back in 2000. And then in 2010, there was a DFID program called Shiri, which was set up in Bangladesh. It was a poverty graduation program, which had bits of climate change adaptation elements, where Uttaran worked on land rights and extreme poverty reduction, where we supported 33,000 extreme poor households, and out of that, about 73% people received land from government. The same land problem I was telling you about, that people lives in the farthest edge. So at the same time, the project's evaluation came out about 92% graduation, and that funding was basically if DFID set up probably a system in country Bangladesh called Shiri, and from that there was open call. It was INGOs, local NGOs, everyone could have applied. We applied as our own, and that was the first time we received FCDO or DFID funding directly. Later on, that project went for 7 years till 2017, but probably due to Brexit or something else. Later in COVID, there was a discussion that it would come again, but somehow it never came. But that was one of the brilliant program of FCDO DFID in Bangladesh. Later, there was a funding called CLARE, which is one of the flagship climate change program funded by FCDO with IDRC, and there was a global open call. So we wrote the global open call, competed. So all the money we have gathered from FCDO was through open fair competitions. So we write proposals, we come up with brilliant ideas, hopefully, and then we get the financing. We also get financing through our INGO partners and networks like the START network, and through other British INGOs like Save the Children and others, because we were mostly treated as implementing organizations. But since 2010, we started changing narratives that we can do much more meaningful work if we write the proposals and if we can compete. Of course, most fundings are closed off for international NGOs. Local NGOs have very limited access to open calls, where we are not registered under British laws and British system or European system. But all the limited fundings that's open to the global bodies or global organizations or local organizations, we would write and we take part in those competitions.
And
these are most.
For the open calls where you've been successful, for each one of those, how many would you apply to that you haven't been successful for?
Sorry, can you kindly repeat that question?
So you've obviously been successful in a number of instances where you've received money from the FCDO. In comparison, how often are you applying to programs that you're not successful for?
I think it's weird that at least in my last 8 years tenure with Uttaran, all the open calls we have applied, we received it. There's basically two. One was the CLARE funding, and the other one is called the Ocean funding by DEFRA. And we have a DEFRA funding at the moment, and we have the CLARE funding at the moment.
Okay.
And before that, there was a few instances where we have been denied, probably because of poor written projects. But before that, the last direct funding was 2010 through DFID, Shiri project. And then later on, we received it through other INGO partners and national NGO bodies like Manushya Jonna Foundations and others.
Okay, brilliant. If I can sort of put the same question to Dishon in terms of your organisation and your access to finance through the UK, has your experience been similar, sort of open calls for applications, or have you had other routes to UK finance?
For most of I'll speak on Get to Oceans Alive first. We have been fortunate, and I will say, because the UK funding actually is very competitive, to have received funding from DEFRA, from the UK through DEFRA under the Darwin Initiative. In 2024 to 2025, we received a 1-year funding from Darwin to build the capacity and capability for the beach management units within Kilifi County. This was essentially a 1-year project funding of approximately 100,000 British pounds. And we were working with 17 beach management units, bringing together about 3,430 fishermen. And the other funding that we have also received from UK is the most recent funding from under the Oceans Community. This is a 3-year funding directly to Oceans Alive. And within that project, we'll be working to support a framework that has only been recently established by the government, which is referred to as the Joint Core Management Areas. And we'll be working within one specific JCMA, that's Kama Mpuki, which brings together 5 beach management units. And the funding that we have received is about 250,000 British pounds. And essentially, the project will be working to actually build the capacity as well as address the use of illegal fishing gears, as well as enforcement within this JCMA. The JCMA I'm talking about is about 30,000 hectares. But previously, I also worked with an organization called East Africa Wildlife Society way back about 18 years back, and we also received funding from the Darwin Initiative to actually initiate a process that has actually now been fully adopted by the government, which is the one that I just mentioned called the JCMA. But that funding, when we received it, we didn't have JCMAs, and we worked within a framework called CCA, Community Conserved Areas. And it's simply to pilot establishment of these community pilot observation areas, where local communities could actually establish areas within the ocean which they could manage. But since then, that framework has been adapted and has been incorporated within what is part of the collaborative fisheries management, where now the local communities can establish this area, but working collaboratively within the government. UK government, through Darwin, was actually very instrumental because it was the first funding that piloted that approach way back in 2009. What I can say about the UK funding is that it's very competitive. I could say on average, the success rate in terms of when you apply is about 30%. I would say that's my personal experience. Some other people have had a lower rate because the funding is usually very, very competitive. And the entities applying for this funding are many. But one thing that I could say that has been very key in terms of success is that in all these applications that I've mentioned, except the latest on ocean community, the application was also done in partnership with the UK-funded NGO. And one of the key partners that we worked with in trying to access that funding is Fauna and Flora International. And also the other thing was also UK, I would say, interest in seeing initiatives that are either innovative or initiatives that are clearly aligned with what I would say UK strategy, or rather trying to address global commitments and conservation. So you'll find that in all those areas that I've mentioned that we have been successful, much of the work has actually tried to see how Kenya can increase either its commitment under global frameworks, either the Convention on Biological Diversity or the Kunming-Montreal Protocol for 30 by 30.
Yeah, that's great. I'm just gonna jump in there, just hand over to my colleague Noah, who's got a follow-up question.
Yeah, but just wondering as well, Dishon, about the challenges you face at the grassroots when trying to access this kind of funding. Because you mentioned direct funding from FCDO, but how is it in terms of getting access? What barriers do you face in terms of getting access to that kind of funding?
As I mentioned, it's not exactly a barrier. I would say it's not exactly a barrier, but I would say that one, the funding, as I mentioned earlier, is very, very competitive. The other thing is that usually even the process of evaluation is actually very, very, very intensive. I'll give you a good example. The ocean community funding that we recently were able to access. I think worldwide, I don't know, I came to understand only about 14 organizations were funded worldwide. And in Kenya, we were the only ones who are actually successful to access this funding. So the key thing is that it's competitive, very competitive. It's not actually just a barrier. That I will not consider it as a barrier. The other thing is that it's usually very key, focused in the area that we focused, very key in aspect of who they consider can qualify for funding. particularly if there is a need to engage local communities. Funding that we have been able to access and succeed is because, one, most of the funding is usually earmarked for organizations or locally based organizations that are directly working with the beneficiaries.
Dishon,
So
I'm
it's
going to
not
pause
actually
you there, Lionel. I'm going to pause you there. We're running out of time. Zahid, I think you want to come in quickly.
Yes, I think there are certain barriers. See, the organizations, the type of organizations we have been historically implementing organizations. There have been the partnership we had with any institutions or development partners or INGOs, where because we were supposed to implement what the projects they have designed, there was never a support for institution building in general. For example, Save the Children or any other INGOs will have a humanitarian disaster team all throughout the year, even there are no disasters. For Uttaran, if there are no disaster, there are no humanitarian disaster team who's getting ready to do something if there are. So, a challenge for us is this. The second thing, there, of course, you have been funding us. There are few funds that we competed was on projects. But we never had a grants team who can write and compete in such projects. So that means the institutions runs based on project financing. The second thing, there are limitations to what we can, how much are open for a local NGO and what is open to an INGO. There are certain projects that are sealed off to UN and INGOs, and there is only a few drops where it comes to local grant. And you can see even the current funding in Bangladesh, the funding you have is led by big NGOs. And because I know you want to do things at scale, but there's that gap. The last thing, I also want to take this opportunity to mention one thing. See, you have at least 7-8 different fundings at this moment in Bangladesh to different NGOs, INGOs, and local NGOs. These fundings are all in silos. There is no coordination mechanism that says, yes, this project can support that project and that project can support this project. The best person to know how many projects there are by UK government, by Dutch government, by European government, by German government is my field colleague or field staff who is at the village. He can see this as raindrops, all this water is coming in his face, and is there with a bowl catching all whatever he can for a single household. This is not to overlap activities. This is to complement. For example, the Surfit project fund you fund us to forecast tidal surge, forecast a certain disaster. To take action, there are other funding that needs to help to take the action, because once you have the forecast, my forecast can say that store water if you get a forecast of tidal surge, but there is no water in 4 kilometers range. So how does one stores water? But probably another funding of yours have a water project that you fund, or a Dutch fund where you all sit together through a development partners coordination committee at the national level. But none of us are coordinating in that level. And it's only my field staffs and other projects field staffs or other NGOs field staffs trying to say, hey, there are certain needs here, so can you come here? So there are challenges, of course. There are those certain barriers that we local NGOs have never been supported on building its institution. Similar goes for local communities. And the second thing is that there is lack of coordination. One other example I want to make. Since 1998 till 2010, European Union and FCDO spent near about 500 crore taka, which is about 50 million pounds or so. Yes, around 50 million pounds on relief and recovery efforts for waterlogging. But after 2010 into the 2015, the Bangladesh government spent about 20 million pounds to do tidal river management, which is one of the indigenous idea to revive the rivers and reduce waterlogging. That worked for next 12 years. But one of the reason a lot of FCDO fund did not target that area, it was a gray area. It was an indigenous knowledge. There was lack of evidences. And so you cannot finance that. There are more financing, humanitarian finance, than trying out a nature-based solution at that period. Of course, a lot of things have changed now.
Zahid, can I pause you there, because I think that Janet wants to ask you some more about this exact area. Janet, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. So Zahid, thank you for everything you've said already, but you have sort of like answered the question that I'm about to ask you. So anything more you want to say on it would be really helpful, and it's about how grassroots organisations really influence the decision on how climate finance should be used. So, and the question will be asked to Dishon as well. So the full question is, in your experience, how much leadership and ownership do local and grassroots organisations have in deciding how climate finance is used? So we go to yourself first, Zahid.
Yeah, in just a basic start, in my organization, about 80% of the finances are not decided by me. So there is one about me, which is I am a grassroots actor. And then there is about decision of the community. And almost only 2 or 3% is decided by the community. About 20% is decided, or not even 20, maybe I'm over exaggerating. Maybe 10 is decided by me, and the rest is decided either by my partners who writes well, who reports well, who maintains the compliance probably much better than myself. I don't know. And there are certain barriers to whatever I was saying. But if you talk about ownership, and then that's about leadership, that we cannot lead how climate finance works. But if we ask about ownership, yes, of course, 80 or 90% of the projects, we really own it, because we say, even if it's not the right, let's say some project gives me a hand pump, deep tube well for drinking water.
Yes.
I don't know this. So I said this wouldn't work because the groundwater is saline. You need reverse osmosis to treat the water.
Zahid, if you felt there was more opportunity for leadership, do you think you'll be able to progress more and do better with the climate financing?
If we had leadership, at least we think we would be able to design better, meaningful finances for the communities. Yes. So I don't know how much my organization would progress, but as a whole, I know Southwest Bangladesh or Southwest Coastal Bangladesh at least much better than a better global NGO. I grew up here. I was born here. I lived here. I spent my life. I studied at Oxford. I came back to my village. You gave me scholarship, and then I came back. But I came back because I know more, and I want to share that more with the finances. So financiers, yeah. But what I'm basically trying to say, to have more meaningful fund. There is already a lot of meaningful fund. There is opportunities, and there is evolution, like the clear financing, like the ocean financing, where you can set a global framework of objective, but not dictate the activities or not dictate how and through which approach. So, of course, there is more we can do, but just wanted to say that. Yes.
Brilliant. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much, Zahid. Dishon, could I ask you the same question, please?
Yes.
Dishon, Lionel Dishon, yeah? A brief answer, please.
Yes, I'll be brief. I could say that the picture is changing. When I came to this world, the communities were mere beneficiaries. They didn't decide how much money, where. Someone else came, define their needs, their wants, when developed a proposal, submitted to a donor. They received the funding, came to implement with the community. But things have changed. I can say right now, the communities have established networks. The communities, their frameworks that are existing right now on the ground, which actually communities now determine what they need, how much they need, and who implements. Already there are structures right now on the ground where communities can actually receive funding and implement those projects. UK funding, as well as other funding from many other donors, has actually been put, a lot of it has already been put in building the capacity of these local entities that represent the local communities. What am I talking about? Who are these local communities? These are the beach management units, the Community Forestry Association, the Water Resource Users Association. So essentially, the picture now is changing, but that was not the situation. And this change has only been taking place recently. The JCMAs and the CMAs that I'm talking about, where communities collaboratively engage with the government to actually drive conservation and sustainable use of marine resources, have only been established just as recently as 2024.
Wow.
So the picture is changing. It has not been the same as within the last 20 years that I've been working. But there's some huge promise as well as indications regarding to where we're headed.
Lionel
There's a barrier
Michel, why did that change happen in 2024?
So this is essentially what has been happening. In 2007, the government came up with the Beach Management Unit regulation, which established the Beach Management Unit. 2010, the Kenyan government came up with the Kenyan constitution, which stretched the aspect of devolved governance, as well as aspect to do with participatory participation of communities in any decisions that government is making, particularly in the use of their resources, be it marine, coastal, or even forest, or anything like that. Now, the operationalization of that one has taken a long process. Fortunately enough, there is a project that has been funded by the World Bank that is coming to an end into this year, actually in June 2026, that actually supported the establishment of these JCMAs. The law itself to establish the JCMA was actually established in 2007. But actually, the first JCMA was established way back in 2010. That's the one I was talking about with the Darwin funding. But since then, there have been no other JCMAs established. It's only now with the funding that the Kenya government received from the World Bank that now the JCMA concept framework has been rolled across all the marine waters from the border in Kenya and Tanzania all the way to the border with Kenya and Somalia. So that is the one that has actually now rolled out. What essentially should have been rolled out 19 years back. But now that's what I'm saying, that the situation is changing.
Thank you. David?
Yeah, to continue on a similar theme, Zahid, can I ask you, in your view, what policy or funding changes the UK government could make to climate change that would make climate change finance that would make it more accessible, effective, and impactful to your communities?
Hey, we can't hear you. Why don't we...
Sorry.
We got you.
Yes. So a very short answer to that is to take leadership and give out leadership, which basically means that there are some space that you should be acting more than a funder. Of course, you're a funder for my country, but you can play a much bigger role in country where you have a high commission, you have staffs, you have colleagues, you have policy advisors. For example, at this moment, Uttaran hosts 2 UK funding. I know at least 10 other NGOs who also host different UK funding. And I meet them through individual personal requirement, but I do not meet them because the British system asks me to do, right? That's one. I meet other program-wise funding. The CLARE funders, I meet all the CLARE colleagues across the world, across Bangladesh and everything. But if there is a separate financing, let's say ocean financing, I do not meet an ocean grantee in Bangladesh or across the world through CLARE financing. So every financing that you set up, it becomes, the coordination happens within that financing. So that's number one. So the ask of leadership or the ask of policy change or approach change is you take leadership. And the second thing is you give out leadership. What is the giving out of leadership? There is a strange, nice financing called Reversing the Flow by Dutch government. It's a Dutch subsidy grant called the Reversing the Flow, where they have allowed the project. So you get a certain amount of financing. You do not decide what the financing is at that moment. You set maybe larger protocols or larger principles, and then you go out to communities. After 6 months, you tell that this is what the community needs. So this allows one community or one organization or the fund to address climate change problems, including its root causes, its contextual vulnerabilities, and intersectional vulnerabilities. Every community is different, unique. Every landscape is unique. One problem intersects with others. So that's another approach. But what I'm basically saying that so of course that might be very challenging to give out public financing or taxpayers' money without knowing on what you're giving out to. The other simple mechanism is to have countrywide representation or regional-wise representation in larger committees like the Ocean Financing did, where they have communities of activists, researchers, practitioners in helping and assisting the financing mechanism to decide who gets the finances. And that's the third thing. And the last thing is to keep it open. Let's keep it competitive. We love being competitive, but let's not limit based on certain size, certain expertise, or certain region. Because you never know, someone can come up with very amazing ideas with very good implementation skill, with very right kind of work. So just being small, working in a certain region should not be a limiting factor for that organization to lead. Yes, so these are the four things.
Elizabeth, do you have any thoughts on what changes would make a difference?
Yes, I have some recommendations, and one is the fact that I believe the most effective climate finance is the one that is supposed to reach the communities even before the crisis reaches to them. And so being able to put in more resources into getting the communities to prepare for disaster. And this also means getting to invest in solutions that the communities are already leading on the ground, vis-a-vis only putting in much resources into responding to the disaster. So we need to also see a lot more financing going into disaster preparedness so that the communities can be able to build their resilience. And I think this is also going to reduce the resources that may be needed to actually recover from the disasters. And the second aspect is, especially for the African continent, we know that Africa is a youthful continent, and being able to build acceleration ecosystems that are actually youth-focused and are catalytic and can be able to actually drive mass action when it comes to addressing the climate crisis among the young people and among the communities will be very effective. So is the aspect of being able to increase the investments on the stakeholders who are actually building pro-youth ecosystems, because without this, it means that we are not really ready for the future of the African continent. So we cannot be able to say that we are building an Africa that is going to be climate resilient if the majority of the population is not part and parcel of the financing ecosystems that exist. And of course, understanding that most of these youth-led entities, again, are also, within the grassroots and need to be able to have systems that allow them to access resources without having to maybe, without having to also compete with sort of really big entities within the space. So we need an ecosystem that also allows for the UK as well to trust credible grassroots institutions to be able to continue spearheading their work. And the fourth aspect is also allowing the communities to define what works for them. And I'll give a good example with restoration and conservation, which sometimes with funding allocations, there are specifics with which people would define that this is the amount of allocation that would be needed for restoration. But then for people working at the communities on the ground, you realize that there is much more to restoration that also comes with being able to ensure that these communities can also be able to improve their lives, because they are the ones who are the custodians of the ecosystem that we are restoring today. And if we are not able to be able to provide financing that also ensures that communities can thrive, then it's going to be difficult. For instance, there is a lot of resources to be able to bring back specific species, but you go to the same communities and there is no resources to build a hospital within a community that is actually living, living with this ecosystem and restoring it each and every day and protecting it. So we need to also redefine that aspect on how we also finance conservation. And the last aspect is on putting in more resource into the ecosystem services, because right now we have a lot of declining critical ecosystem services that has actually been accelerated by the climate crisis. And our water catchments right now are under so much pressure, which means that it's also going to cost us more to grow food. It's going to cost us more in terms of health. It's going to also affect a lot within our economic developments as countries. So we need to be able to see a lot of resources also being channeled toward improving the ecosystem services. And it has to be a holistic approach that works with the communities, that also ensures that as the communities are being supported to restore the ecosystems, that their lives and their livelihoods are also improving each and every time.
Zahid, I know that you've got your hand up, but Sam wants to ask some questions which might cover it, or we'll come to you at the very end if it doesn't.
Thanks. Yeah, and that's quite a good segue, actually, what Elizabeth's just been talking about. And this is to you, Elizabeth, and it's thinking about long-term sustainability. Could you give maybe some tangible examples from your work and what you've seen of sort of effective capacity and capability building at grassroots in how climate finance is delivered?
Yes, so part of the work that we are doing at the Green Generation Initiative is actually focusing on the conservation, protection, and the restoration of ecosystems. And this is by working directly with communities and also by implementing the water funds that ensure that different stakeholders, including the water utility companies, the private sector, the beverage companies that depend on water for their businesses, the government, all these stakeholders come together to actually support communities who are upstream directly with resources for them to be able to adopt certain land conservation measures so that the ecosystems can actually be healthy and so that the people downstream cannot have the issues of water. And this model has really worked a lot. We've seen water yields increase by up to 15%. We've also seen communities actually generating a lot of income from the sale of their produce, because when the ecosystems are healthy, it means that they can actually have a lot of productivity within their farmlands. And so this model ensures that we are able to, number one, introduce the indigenous trees in the degraded ecosystems. And at the same time, within the farmlands, the farmers can be able to grow the fruit trees. They can be able to have aspects of them being able to harvest water, like the water ponds, where they not only store and harvest water, but they can also do certain economic generating activities like the fish, like doing the fish production, and also the aspects of beekeeping. And all these land conservation measures are an incentive for the communities to be able to continue restoring the ecosystems. And this has really supported the people downstream, because when this happens, the communities are happy, they're able to continue living their lives and and sort of like continue promoting their work in a big way. And at the same time, the people downstream can be able to have access to water. And so this is a model that shows how improving livelihoods and building community climate resilience and entrusting communities directly with resources can actually be able to empower them and yield results for so many other people. And we actually intentionally deploy these nature-based solutions and appropriate technologies to be able to strengthen the community resilience. And a lot of times we've seen that when climate finance is sort of like allocated, there is an aspect that misses with the communities, because they're the ones that are responding to these impacts each and every day. And so I think this is a model that actually works. And these case studies should be also out there to be able to showcase what can change within communities when we actually entrust them with resources directly.
Thank you. And Zahid, same to you really, on the benefits of locally led bottom-up approaches to climate action, and helpfully if you're able to give sort of tangible examples from your work that we could understand and relate to.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are many. One of the most amazing work, I would say, in Bangladesh with FCDO financing was the Shiri financing that we had from 2010 to 2017, where we managed to give out lands to near about, not, it wasn't our land, it was government land. Your project, your finance facilitated the process, and near about 25,000 households. If you gather the value of land in terms of the value of the project, compare that with the value of project, it was 10 times more. And this land, for a landless household who is a farmer and never had land, always worked as peasants or slaves, changed their whole life. I think there were, at the time, back in 2015, there were some member of the parliament who visited the project as well, and who saw that how those lands were changing their lives. And I think if those MPs or you as MPs can come and see that same households who never had anything, used to live on government land or on embankments, on dikes, they are now head of local governments. They are now owners of businesses. They do rights. They have their whole rights for the whole year. And this is not just households or two households. These are thousands of households across your financing, through not just Shiri, but through other financing that you supported land rights program of Uttaran since the early 2000 till end of 2017. So huge amounts of work that you supported. Another one, which you kind of directly finance, but the tidal river management, you were supporting the waterlogging for as relief money, and at the same time Uttaran was supporting and advocating to the government that indigenous ideas.
Zahid, I'm afraid we're losing your signal. Maybe okay. Sam, if the next two questions will go to Elizabeth.
Yes.
Can I? Okay.
We'll come back to you in. We'll come back to you in a minute. Let your signal stabilise. We just got so Elizabeth.
I'm conscious of the time as well on the next panel. Elizabeth, interested to just know how locally led approaches contribute to gender equality and around the inclusion of women and girls.
Yeah, so I'd love to give practical examples of how we are working with the women. And I mentioned about the initiatives that we are leading with the women in the communities that are located adjacent to the critical water catchment areas. And we are actually mostly working with women, and these include the women that are part of the households and also young mothers, especially within the critical catchment areas that are degraded. And what we have seen is the fact that these women, especially with the rising impacts of the climate crisis, there are limited economic opportunities for them to be able to continue supporting their livelihoods. And so when we come in with this approach that not only enables them to come to the catchments and restore the degraded ecosystems, but also they're able to go back to their lands and introduce these land conservation measures that enable them to generate income, we are seeing a lot of aspects where there is also like reduction, for instance, in the domestic violence that sometimes would occur when there is no food to eat or consume within the household. And the second aspect is that at least they are now able to generate extra revenue that enables them to also take their children to school as usual, compared to when they are not able to have any support to even do their day-to-day engagements. And the third aspect is that the women are now being able to come together, organize themselves, and even build cooperatives, because within the water funds model, we also have an aspect where the women are coming together and building cooperatives that can enable them to, for instance, ensure that they can sell some of their produce. For instance, the Golden House avocados, which is also very nutritious, but also a really golden aspect when it comes to also exporting and putting it out there for sale. And so these women are coming together and being able to generate revenue collectively by being able to put in their produce together. And the other aspect is that it's also influencing policy in a big way, because when systems begin to work at a local level, when systems begin to work in a community setting, then it also influences leaders within other regions who want to replicate what is already working within that community. And so I'm a strong believer of policy also be influenced by what is working right down there at the grassroots, at the community, because this is what gets the leaders also to want to see the same replicated in their regions. And so this has continued to define.
I don't know how you've spoken so long without pausing. We agree with you on your analysis about what's important, but we have run out of time for this session. I think both you and the committee could talk about this all day. It's very much the start of our inquiry. This is literally the first session. Zahid, I know you're desperate to get in, but I'm afraid you're going to have to write to us on it. Thank you all very much. Please, this is the beginning of the conversation that we're having, so keep on giving us the thoughts that you've got. But I have to say, particularly your comments about local leadership resonated very strongly with me, and there were lots of members around the tables whose heads were nodding when you were saying that. So thank you very much for your time. If I could ask the second panel to step up now, please. Please keep in touch, and goodbye, first panel. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Have we got Professor Avinash?
Yes, we should do. No worries. Sorry, thanks, Sam.
Professor, are you on the... Professor Avinash, can you hear and see us?
I can hear and see you. Can you hear and see me?
I can. It looks like you've got a decapitated soldier in the background, though. It's quite scary. If he starts walking towards me, I'm getting out of here. I'm telling you that right now.
It's still winter in Washington.
Just in case. Okay, well, if you need to rush to it at any point, then I understand. And also, May, can I thank you very much for joining us in the room. Apologies to both of you that we're running a little late, but I think if you were listening to the last session, you'll realise what excellent witnesses we had. So it seemed only fair to take first-hand testimony from them. I wonder if I could start you both by introducing yourselves. May, could I ask you, who are you and what organisation are you representing?
Thank you very much for having me here. My name is Aung, and I work at the International Institute for Environment and Development. I've been working there for about 5 years. I work on promoting the locally led adaptation agenda and am fortunate enough to work with a lot of the organizations in the panel before, like Uttaran. And I'm originally from Myanmar, so I very much care about the perspectives of LDCs, the voices of communities, and IED is an institution that puts people at the center. We care about fairness, human-centered approaches, and sustainability, and we work very much in partnership with partners from the Global South to generate evidence that can influence policy.
Lovely. Thank you. Professor Avinash.
Hi, my name is Avinash Persaud. Please call me Avinash or Avi. I am currently in Washington, D.C. As the special advisor to the president of the Inter-American Development Bank, one of the largest regional development banks. Our region, Latin America and the Caribbean, is, as you know, the most vulnerable region to climate shocks. Before that, I was working for the Barbados government, architect of the Bridgetown Initiative, negotiator of the IMF program and debt restructuring, World Bank loans and IDB loans, which gave me a fair bit of experience relevant to this space. And before that, I grew up in London in the United Kingdom. You can hear from my accent.
We can.
And I was in international finance, and for my sins, I ended up in financial regulation, where I was one of the architects of Basel III banking regulation.
Abby, could I ask you this question then? In The Guardian today, there was a powerful article suggesting quite strongly that the government was looking to drop its commitment to climate finance. You'll know that over successive, the last government and this government, they've been committed to £11.6 billion for climate finance, and apparently now we're looking at cutting 2.6 billion off that. What would be the consequence if that cut is true?
Well, look, the financing gaps for resilience and development that is climate sensitive are enormous. Estimated by the independent high-level expert group led by Lord Stern and Amar Bhattacharya and Vera Songwe, estimated at $2.4 trillion a year. of which 1.3 trillion needs to come from international finance. The total amount of international finance, ODA, dedicated to climate, UK and others included, was around $100 billion, if you include what they did through the multilateral development banks. 1/12 of what's needed. So these climate finance gaps are big, and we really need to have more climate finance rather than less. But I would say that given that this is a battle of scarce resources, it's very important how we strategically structure this finance. It is possible that the UK can have greater impact than it did in the past, even with a less aggregate figure, if it fully utilizes, as it's trying to do, I have to say, London as a green hub for those things that can be funded by the private sector. I'm no blind private sector zealot who believes they can do everything, but there's some things they can do now that renewable energies are for 90% of the world the cheapest form of energy. And then the UK can use its leadership position in the multilateral development banks without putting in much new money, where it can leverage its dollars by up to tenfold. And if it encouraged the MDBs to be focused on resilience, public infrastructure resilience, that's where the big multiples are. $1 spent on a new seawall saves you $10, and then focused its remaining cash on responding to climate-related loss and damage. And it can be a leader in international climate loss and damage if it focused its money in that way. It can remain a leader on resilience and on loss and damage, but it requires a more structured, strategic approach. Spreading a thinner and thinner amount of money across more and more things is going to actually have an exponentially worse impact.
And loss and damage is one of those phrases that seems to make people's hackles rise. Can you give us an example of what that would look like in practice?
Yeah, so I came late to climate finance. I before was very much focused on development and international business, and then I got asked to help support Dominica after Hurricane Maria, when it lost 226% of GDP. And so this was the 2017 Atlantic hurricane season. It lost 226% of GDP in 4 hours. So I had to do a crash course in learning. And all these terms, people combine these terms together on climate, but they mean very different things, and they're financed very differently. So mitigation is about reducing the emissions, and renewable energy, sustainable agriculture will do that. We haven't done enough mitigation. So now we need to adapt and build resilience. So adaptation is dealing with the climate change that's already here. And then finally, well, we haven't done enough adaptation or resilience. So you need to respond to loss and damage. In our region, we've had the recent horrific Hurricane Melissa. It destroyed almost $10 billion of Jamaican GDP. We've had enormous flooding in Brazil, which has also cost a lot of lives. Responding to loss and damage is responding to the disasters that we haven't adapted for and haven't mitigated for.
Thank you. And May, could I ask you, there's a principle of polluter pays. Thinking specifically about low-income countries, many with quite heavy, dirty colonial boots on them, what message will it send if we step back from our commitments?
If we set the commitment that the polluter pays is the principle that should be followed. I would take a step back and think about the polluter pays principle as a whole. So within the UNFCCC, it is based on that polluter pays principle, that historical emissions from the past is why developed countries are now responsible for supporting developing countries in achieving their climate goals. And so I think this principle has already been agreed on at the global level by both developed and developing countries, so it wouldn't be a signal in another direction or a missignal if you did choose the principle of polluter pays as being foundational to climate action in the future. And I think if we look at impact from the community level and what this inquiry is about, is it effective at the community level? A lot of communities are suffering from very tangible everyday things of rivers getting polluted, not being able to fetch water because waterways are polluted. Their land is being filled with rubbish from other countries. So I think communities would be happy to hear about the pollute pays principle and it being implemented as well.
Let me hand you over to Tracy.
Hi both, thank you for attending today. Could I ask you both, I'll maybe come to Anish first, what are the common challenges facing climate vulnerable countries such as SIDS and LDCs?
So, firstly, they're dealing with, if you're talking about SIDS, they're dealing with rising sea level. The ice caps don't melt at the poles. That water ends up at the equator. So tropical small island developing states are facing increased sea levels. And that's where their GDP is, often at the coast. So it has a big impact. These storms and hydrological disasters are having massive impacts. Flooding. We're not seeing more Category 5 hurricanes, but we're seeing more disastrous hurricanes because they carry more water, because they come over the Atlantic through warmer seas, and so they end up being more destructive. But what we've learned from these disasters is you can build resilience to them. So a dollar spent on public infrastructure, as I said before, so better seawalls, stronger seawalls, more resilient flood defenses, drainage systems, heavy, unglamorous public infrastructure can save $10 for every dollar that it costs. And that's, I believe, one of the key priorities of multilateral development banks, to lend low cost, long term for countries to become resilient today.
Thank you. And to me, on LDCs, what?
Yes, so a couple of points to add to that. In addition to the impacts of climate change, I think the SIDS and LDCs are consistently facing the lack of recognition and a voice at the negotiating table in different global spaces to have their perspectives heard and actually be able to push their positions forward against corporations that are still consistently emitting and contributing to climate change, having their voices heard in UNFCCC and other global negotiation spaces, and at the same time dealing with the very real day-to-day impacts of climate change in people's lives. They're also facing issues around rising debt, trying to bring their countries to meet development needs and, basic things like bringing electricity, having 100% electrification, having food security, having education for all citizens, but then also being in debt and taking on further more and more debt in order to meet basic needs of society.
So you've both touched on this in terms of the impacts of climate change. Is there anything else in addition to the point you've raised about the impacts on the countries that are climate related that you've not already added to my first question?
I would just say threats to basic livelihoods. People are very dependent on ecosystems and ecosystem services without, industry developed for example, in Myanmar, there are a lot of agrarian livelihoods, and agriculture is very susceptible to the impacts of climate change. And with that compounded with conflict going on, people are unable to make ends meet. So, and then with ecosystem decline, being able to forage for food just doesn't even become an option anymore. So these are the kinds of things that countries are facing. And the conversation before about coral reefs are essential for fisheries and also livelihoods, particularly lives of women that are gleaners, collect mussels, and they are unable to meet their livelihood needs because of ecosystem decline, because of the decline of coral reefs. So, yeah, everyday impacts that people are unable to adapt to.
Thank you, mate. And Avinash, is there anything that you would like to add?
The one thing I would add is that and I think May and others have touched on this, but the intersectionality of all these things, of debt, development, and climate, they compound each other. They're not separate issues. So, for example, and I don't think SIDS are highly vulnerable. SIDS are the canaries in the mine. When I was helping to lead the Bridgetown Initiative, we used to say we're the canaries in the mine, but our conclusion is not that we need an air supply for ourselves, but to fix the mine. So we do need to think about vulnerability across the board. But one of the things that SIDS suffer from is that they've become very fragile. Their GDP per capita, their national income per head, still looks quite high. It's just it can be wiped away in 4 hours. They suffer wipeout risk. But the current international financial architecture does not take that into account. It doesn't make them eligible for concessional funding because their national income is high. They then spend, the evidence is that countries that suffer from climate impacts, and that's not just SIDS, that's across Latin America and the Caribbean, mountainous states, landlocked states, but they suffer increased debt. So they've been using debt to absorb these losses. So they've become fiscally unsustainable, or at least fiscally less, they have less space to respond. And so we need new instruments to help the fiscally challenged build up resilience straight away.
Thank you. Thank you both. Chair.
Thank you. Monica.
Thank you. To Avinash, if I may, first, what does UK climate finance do least and most effectively relative to its international counterparts?
I think that the UK role in the multilateral system is very important. It has been intentional about that. It is one of the things that has political challenges, because you could imagine local national governments quite like bilateral funding. And so supporting the multilateral system, and it goes into a system and other people decide how that money is spent, is not always politically popular, but it's very powerful. The multilateral system has greatest leverage. The UK has been a leader in the multilateral system. I hope it continues to be so, and that means continuing investing in that system, but also the reform of that system. Bridgetown and others helped to increase the lending headroom by multilateral banks by about $700 billion. But that's only halfway there. We need to double that. What does it do least well? I think that the UK and other donors, we have quite a good system of humanitarian assistance. And we have to make a distinction between climate loss and damage money and humanitarian assistance. The humanitarian sector is pretty good in terms of its organization. It could always do with more money. But when a disaster hits, within 24 hours, food and water is being flown in, that's the humanitarian assistance. What we're very bad at is what happens afterwards. When you've got your communities under blue tarpaulin, I don't know why it's always blue tarpaulin, and you've got them sheltering, and you've got them fed and watered, fine, but who's going to rebuild the homes? Who's going to rebuild the communities? And that's where the international system is poor. And I think that should be the focus of the new fund for responding to loss and damage. I'm not sure it is, but it could do with more money and more focus.
So on that, you say that is an area that the UK could lead, but you seem to be also saying that it's a place that we're bad at. So are we starting from a low base, but we could make great strides because there's nobody else doing it, or what's the thinking behind that?
So the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage, which the UK supported in its creation, has around $800 million. just remember that loss and damage is about $250 billion every year. So it doesn't take a lot to make that fund bigger and more responsive. And it wouldn't take a big proportion of UK funding to do so. So I think the UK could lead in that area, partly because there isn't enough action going on in that area. Sadly, is a sad reality. It would be wrong to say the UK is poor in that area. It's just that it could do a lot more, and a lot more is needed.
No, did you want to come in on this?
No.
I should let Monica continue. It was more the last.
So comparative with other countries on that loss and damage, where does the UK sit? Or are you seeing it in terms of multilateral assistance that the UK could lead?
Good question. So Germany, France, Italy put in around $100 million each. The UK committed to up to $60 billion. Up to £60 million, up to. So we don't really know what up to means, but it certainly puts money into the fund. But you can see how it wouldn't require a significant chunk of the climate finance in the UK to be a leader in loss and damage financing.
I understand, thank you. Can I turn to you, May? We've already heard from Avinash about the implications for the cuts, the suggested cuts in climate finance allocation. So given the UK's constrained resources, how can it maximise the impact, quality and effectiveness of its climate finance in climate vulnerable country settings?
Of course, it would be great if there was more financing available so that more money can go to SIDS and LDCs and groups of women, children, Indigenous people, LGBTQI plus individuals. But we all know that this is a resource-constrained world, and I think that it's important to focus on a couple of effective and transformative changes that can be implemented with the less amount of money that we're going to have. So the first is investing in transformative, not just gender responsive, but gender just initiatives. And what I mean by that is putting money into gender justice, which is addressing the root causes of inequality that is faced by marginalized people, recognizing the different groups that are at risk because of climate change, and making sure that they do have direct access to funding, that they can reach, that they can decide on their own terms. This is important for us. These are the initiatives that we want to see in adapting to climate change. So those kinds of initiatives are important and transformative and have a long-term impact beyond just a program itself. It's important as well to invest in nature-based solutions because ecosystems are foundational to our survival. And so investing in ecosystems, so under ICF3, there was an investment in forest and there was an investment in nature. So we want to see some ring-fence funding going forward to make sure that this is protected, because especially Indigenous people, local communities really rely on ecosystem services. And as Elizabeth, the previous speaker, mentioned, they are vital to communities to maintain their livelihoods. The second is around transparency. So even with a limited budget, there can be greater efforts made towards enhancing transparency in financing. And one of the things is around making sure that trust is maintained in relationships with partners. So the UK has been very effective in working in partnership, as Avi was saying before, working in partnerships with a lot of different types of intermediaries, sitting on boards of the GCF and promoting initiatives like locally led adaptation. Those are important. But it's important to make sure that the transparency on where the money is going, who it's going to, is clear. So, for example, recently there was a change in the accounting around international climate finance, which made it a little bit interesting in accounting to double count ODA and international climate finance together. So I think the UK could be better in making sure that the accounting is transparent and that we can understand how much is going to international climate finance and how much is ODA. And this makes us accountable to the taxpayers that are interested in, UK taxpayers that are interested in seeing where is the UK spending money on now that there is limited financing. But also we need to take a different approach to accountability to make sure that that transparency is open for the communities that we work with. Currently, it's impossible for local communities to see how much of UK financing is coming to the local community because of so many streams of finance, like Zahid was talking about. Well, how can I say that this money was funding the water pump in my community? We have so many different projects working in this community. So there could be improved transparency around climate finance. There could be greater focus on adaptation as well to align with the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement said there should be equal attention paid to mitigation and adaptation with a particular focus on SIDS and LDCs. The UK hasn't been committing equally 50% over a period of time to adaptation, and so it's important to make sure that we step that up, because adaptation is the impacts of climate change that affects people's lives. And so we would need to see more commitment to adaptation, at least 50%, but maybe even setting a floor of how much money of the limited climate finance that we have is going to adaptation. And that would make a very strong signal to the world that this is how much the UK cares about adaptation.
Yeah.
Can I maybe segue this question back to Avinash, because it seems that there is some agreement there that our very immediate focus and immediate use of resources should be on adaptation and response, as you mentioned earlier, Avinash, just to check that that's sort of agreed on. Are you then saying that actually for that longer term mitigation work, ultimately it is large scale and private capital that is needed? And could you perhaps just, Avinash, talk a bit more about some of the barriers to that? Because you mentioned a lot of the issue comes from debt and presumably debt capacity of both publicly and in the private sector in some of the countries that we're focused on. What efforts are you seeing towards unlocking more capacity for that financing to go in? Because it seems that debt is a pretty hard limit on some of that.
I think this is a really important question and drives at the issue of this, how do we manage the scarcity of resources? Too often I see ministers thinking of this as a kind of a stack of financing, that we have a bit of public finance, we've got a bit of multilateral, so the World Banks, development banks, lending finance, and you've got the private sector. And because the public finance bit is shrinking, and they're going to expand these other things in this horizontal way. And unfortunately, that doesn't work because the private sector can't do everything. It can't do things that generate no revenues. The tremendous amount of public infrastructure that is hugely impactful for adaptation does not generate a revenue. You can't charge for a seawall because everyone benefits from it. It is a classic public good. And equally, debt doesn't work for everybody. You can't tell a country to borrow for loss and damage because every time they get hit, their debt goes up and to the point they become completely unsustainable. So we need a vertical approach where the different financing goes to different things, the things that are most suited for. And that is a way we can hit the 1.3 trillion international finance number. So renewable energy is today the cheapest form of energy in most countries, not every country. And therefore, there's $3 trillion of investment every year in energy, 3 trillion. 2 trillion is now in renewables. But it's not going to developing countries. because developing countries have not micro problems, but macro issues. Their exchange rate volatility, their credit ratings and the credit ceilings which people lend to. So we need to, the MDBs and others and multilateral development banks and others need to manage the macro issues like FX and credit issues, which private sector companies can't do. And that will unblock the flow of private money. So there's a lot of work to be done, and the UK and London could be a hub in which that work gets done. But the private sector is not funding adaptation. There's lots of talk of it doing it, but only 3% of adaptations being funded by them because there's no revenues. That's where the MDBs need to fit in, and the MDBs have the capacity to address the entire adaptation problem. If the shareholders, led by the UK and others, want it to be so, if they want it to be so and make it the priority and make these MDBs expand their lending headroom using things like reforms, like using more guarantees, using more special drawing rights, using more callable capital. I know these are technical terms, but the point is they can do so without hard dollars, expand what the lending headroom, and if they focus on adaptation, you can capture adaptation. And that's when you would put the rest of your money in loss and damage. So private sector to mitigation, MDBs, development banks to adaptation. But remember, has to be low-cost, long-term instruments, including debt swaps. And debt swaps are another technical term. I'm happy to unpack that. But the UK is supporting the expansion of debt swaps, where basically a country gets released some money, which they can use for resilience. The IDB is leading something called the first multi-guarantor debt for resilience swap facility. And that's where a country has the same amount of debt, the same amount of interest payments, but because it's got some guarantee around from a multilateral development bank, money is released which they can devote to resilience. Because as May was saying, they don't have the fiscal space for that. And then it frees up resources to spend on things that can't be funded any other way except for grants. If there's something that can be funded any other way than grants, we need to fund it any other way because we don't have enough grants.
Thank you. Which leads me into David Mundell.
Well, thank you, Avinash. I think you've identified and answered one of the questions I was going to ask you, which was about the risks and challenges associated with private finance. But what more could the government do to leverage in private finance and particularly to identify new and additional sources of climate finance?
So the UK government is funding the development of something called Reinvest Plus that hopefully will launch its first initiative and security of, say, $500 million in London at the end of the year. So what this is to answer this problem. Institutional investors. So who's got all the money? People talk about the private sectors having trillions of dollars of money. Where is that? That's actually held in pension funds and insurance companies. This is institutional money. Institutional money is very institutional. You know, we teach finance. If something makes money, people will finance it. That's not so. Pension funds can't invest in everything. Insurance companies can't invest in everything. They've got external regulation. They also have internal regulation, familiarities, and things they do. And at the moment, only 2% of institutional money goes to developing countries. That's a weird number. That's 2% of institutional money going to where there's 60% of the world's growth. And so we looked into what is the obstacle. And the obstacle to institutional money is they want things that have the same credit rating as they invest in at home, and they want things in the same currency. So what we're doing at Reinvest Plus is we are buying assets in developing countries that are existing and performing, converting them into sterling or euros at the credit rating that institutional investors want. And when the institutional investors buy that and give us as cash, we go and do it again and again and again. But when we buy these assets from the developing countries, we do so on condition that they reinvest the money in those sectors aligned to the national development priorities, including the nationally determined contribution of emissions reduction and national adaptation plans. So it's a way of converting the trillions into projects they don't invest in. For the people who have the experience on the ground, we give them cash to go and do it again. And for the people who only want safe assets, we give them the safe assets. So this is the way the UK can play a catalytic role in supporting these kinds of initiatives without hard dollars, but potentially unleashing billions and billions of dollars.
And when you say we, you're referring to your Inter-American Development Bank, is that right?
Well, we are playing a convening and coordinating role with other partners. One of the things about finance and private finance is a real lack of trust. And so there's a role for public institutions to play not necessarily a subsidized role, but a trusting role, a neutral platform, an independent buyer of assets and seller of assets.
What would the UK government do? Would it have to have its own? I mean, we've got an institution called BII, for example, that's our development finance organisation, or would there have to be some other entity? How would we actually do it?
The interesting aspect here is that it's about coordinating and convening something that would not happen otherwise. So this is about aligning institutional investors and their regulations with the national development plans of governments and local banks who have got assets. Bringing these three people together who don't normally work together, these three things together don't normally, convening that. So, and then issuing the security in a place that understands it. So the UK is playing a critical role in developing that and bringing these three parties who wouldn't normally be together. It doesn't involve continuing money, but it does involve the catalyst to start it and the convening and the pulling together in a trusted way. I hope that makes sense.
It does make sense. Thank you very much. Colleagues, we've got 10 minutes, 6 questions, 2 witnesses, and most of you want to come in. So can I say both to the witnesses but also to the members, can we make it short, tight, snappy going forwards, please? Noah.
Okay, if I can come very briefly to both of you, Avinash first. Taking stock of what you said about the UK's climate finance approach currently, how well aligned is it to the needs and priorities of climate vulnerable countries? Very quickly, please.
I know it's a big focus of the UK government. I believe greater focus on loss and damage, greater support of multilateral development banks to make sure they're giving these vulnerable countries access and instruments that are appropriate to them. And then focusing on breaking down the barriers to getting private finance to those countries would be the 3 things the UK could do more of.
Thank you very much. And May, same question to you very briefly.
Just to add to that, improving access to climate finance by promoting institutional reform. So it's very difficult for national governments and even more so for local community organizations to access finance through some of these institutions. GCF, Adaptation Fund, it's difficult. So the UK can play an instrumental role in streamlining some of the criteria, due diligence criteria, different standards that are imposed on getting access to climate finance. And all of these, many of these institutions have signed up to the locally led adaptation principles that call for institutional reform. So they are already on the right side. They just need this convening power and a push.
Okay, which I guess also links to capacity building needs, which we heard about in our earlier session. Avinash, very briefly, do you have anything to add on the barriers to accessing the UK's climate finance currently?
Having been a borrower, I sometimes feel like there are hoops and loops to stop us getting any cash. And so I think May is absolutely correct. We need to streamline and ease. I would be wary of too much standardization, though. We don't want a monolithic multilateral system, which either lends to you or doesn't lend to you. Different institutions have different areas of focus, the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, the MDBs, but there must be greater streamlining, a greater commitment to getting money out of the door quickly.
Okay. And May, anything to add on how the UK can better adapt its policies to support climate vulnerable countries to access finance?
I think there could be a greater emphasis on ring fencing money for particular target groups like women, children, some of the more vulnerable groups, and also making sure that there is funding towards SIDS and LDCs. At the moment, if you look at, going back to transparency, if you look at the markers, it's actually very difficult to tell how much money is going to gender, how much money is going to particular disaggregated groups within these target groups. So having a ring-fenced funding with maybe easier criteria that's easier for different groups of organizations to access would be an approach. And in addition to working with MDBs and the funds, working with good intermediary organizations. There are majority world philanthropies, there are organizations like IIED, and many others that work in partnership with grassroots organizations that know how to manage risk but also be credible, and making sure that there is funding set aside that can reach good intermediaries is important.
Very briefly, would you describe what you've just outlined as a top-down approach? The ring fencing concept.
It doesn't need to be a top-down approach. I think ring fencing just makes sure that there is funding that can be accessed by certain target groups. But whatever the institution that does manage this fund, they would be responsible for making it flexible. So for example, maybe that fund can ensure that there is a local committee or governance structure that includes different marginalized groups in the committee so that the decision can be made based on the needs of communities. So the ring fencing doesn't translate to top down in particular.
Thank you. Sam.
Thanks. The UK is increasingly using multilaterals to deliver its climate finance. So I wonder if you could comment firstly, Avinash, just on the I suppose on the benefits and risks of this approach, but also if you see any opportunities for the UK to influence reforms to the global climate finance architecture.
So let me try and be brief and answer that in two ways. Firstly, the huge benefit is leverage. So limited amount of existing capital put in a long time ago, or guarantees to these multilateral development banks can lead to a multiple of dollars lent at the lowest borrowing costs. Multilateral development banks are AAA rated. They borrow the cheapest rate possible, and they can on-lend because they're not for profit. They can on-lend that. And so the benefit is leverage. If you've got fewer dollars, you can multiply it by 7, 8, 9, 10 times. But that only applies for things like adaptation and resilience, which I think is where they should be. Finally, on the architecture. The UK has championed something that I think is really quite transformative, but it is not very glamorous and very hard for the public to understand. It's called pause clauses. Now, the vast amount of debt that developing countries have is private creditor debt. It's not official debt. It's not debt lent by countries or by multilateral development banks. It's debt that they issued a bond and private investors borrowed. That's the vast amount of debt. So canceling that debt, restructuring that debt is very difficult, especially if you need to borrow again. So the small island states champion pause clauses. Whenever a disaster hits, debt service, interest and principal is suspended for 2 years, but added back on to the end of the term, which meant the creditor was no worse off. But what the borrower had, the borrower who's been hit by a disaster had, was essential breathing space. So, for example, in the small island states, that frees up 20% of national income instantly as a disaster hits. No other instrument comes close. 20%. The development banks lend 1%, 2% in a disaster. No one's lending you 20%. And that 20% is coming at non-emergency rates. So expanding pause clauses to all debt instruments would transform the debt architecture and make the world much more shock absorbing.
Thank you. That's a great answer.
Thank you. Very briefly, Avinash, what do you think of the work of the London Coalition? How looped into that are you? And does it address some of these points that you've raised?
Is this the London Coalition on regulatory matters?
Debt reform.
They're a few coalitions.
Yeah, I believe there are some climate aspects to those discussions.
Yeah, no, I think that they're making some headway. I would focus on the regulatory changes that stops investors investing in developing countries. There's a committee the UK has got on that, which is doing some good work. Let's come to a conclusion shortly on that, hopefully. And also on the pause clauses, there's more work to be done to standardize those.
Right, thank you.
Thank you. May, what does localization mean when it comes to climate finance?
Localization is going back to gender justice and making sure that the systemic barriers of inequality are addressed. So making sure that marginalized people have a seat at the decision-making table, that they have the resources, that they have the agency to make decisions around making sure that they are able to adapt to climate change on their own terms. But localization is also complex because localization can be national government, if we're thinking from the perspective of MDBs. But if you go to a slum community, localization could be, the community within which the slum resides. So localization means different things to different people, depending on the scale at which we're all operating in. So it's I guess I can't give an easy answer to what localization means.
Perhaps that's part of the problem. If you can't give an easy answer, it doesn't get funded. Janet.
Hi, May. And Avishna. Is gender given enough consideration in the UK climate finance programme, design, planning and implementation? You have already touched on this already, but if there's anything more you can say on it, would be helpful.
Yes. One of the things I mentioned is there could be more concerted monitoring of gender initiatives, and I think the UK is doing great partnerships. So FCDO partners with the Global Alliance, I always get the name messed up, GAGA, Global Alliance for Gender Green Action, and they are a group of good intermediaries. And they make sure that funding is channeled to the local level. They work with grassroots activists, and they're not only just a funder that channels to the local level, but they're an advocate for women's groups, feminist organizations, different groups that they work with. And so these kinds of partnerships should be explored more and encouraged more. So going back to the example of good intermediaries, I think there needs to be more flexible funding in the budget to make sure that the UK can explore more of these partnerships.
Thank you very much.
Avinash, I keep on throughout this session getting frustrated because it doesn't seem as though anybody actually asks the people on the ground what the problems are, what the solutions are, and what they need to achieve them. Can you see any way that we could shift either on a country level or a multilateral level to get to that point?
I don't think that the perspective of local communities is ignored or unheard. Now, the institutional structure is focused top down rather than bottom up. And I think your committee's hearings have been important in emphasizing that we need to consider bottom up. It wouldn't be new to any institution that we need to consider that. How you do that is not that easy. At the COP30, the Brazilians had one of the biggest exercises in bringing in the indigenous peoples of the Amazon into the process. And yet we still had protests by the indigenous peoples saying that they were left out. So voice and whose voice matters, and how we incorporate the voice of the local community, those are easy to say and hard to do. And the other important thing I'd say is yes, it's very important to listen to the community, that the effectiveness of anything we do is undermined if the community is against it and it doesn't make sense for the community. But these are big issues. These are things that requires a national plan. These are issues that require national public infrastructure. And so we need a combination of listening, engaging, understanding, but also thinking at a national level about what we're doing.
That is a great
adaptation and resilience is systemic.
That's a great point to end it on, and that's probably what our inquiry is going to pick away at and try and come up with some solutions. Thank you both very much. We really appreciate your engagement with us today. It's been a great session, and we may well need to come back to you for further guidance and clarification. Order, this session is now